Picture the single most protected port in the Middle East, a fortress of steel, concrete, and layered air defense systems, representing decades of American-funded military architecture, reduced to a graveyard of twisted infrastructure and burning fuel terminals in less than 23 minutes. Picture the naval force that has patrolled the Persian Gulf without interruption since 1995. The force whose presence has been described by 5 successive American administrations as the irreplaceable guarantor of regional stability, executing a full combat withdrawal through the Strait of Hormuz under the cover of darkness, while its public affairs office frantically searched for language that didn't sound like what it was. And picture the moment, the precise, documented, satellite-confirmed moment when Russian S-400 Triumf air defense batteries began appearing at Iranian military installations, their distinctive 96L6 acquisition radars spinning up and painting the skies over the Persian Gulf, with an engagement envelope that rendered every American and Israeli air campaign plan developed over the past 15 years functionally obsolete before a single sortie was flown. These 3 events did not happen sequentially. They happened within a compressed window of 71 hours, a cascade of strategic shocks so tightly choreographed that anyone still clinging to the idea that they were unconnected developments driven by independent circumstances has not been paying attention to how Iran, Russia, and their aligned partners have been constructing this moment for years. This was not improvisation. This was the execution of a strategy that has been patient, disciplined, and invisible to a Western intelligence community that consistently confused the absence of visible preparation with the absence of intent. The S-400 transfer is the development that reorders everything else. Every military analyst, every defense planner, every strategic thinker in Washington and Tel Aviv who has spent years gaming out scenarios for military action against Iran built those scenarios around a common assumption: that Iranian air defenses, while improving, remain penetrable by American stealth aircraft and the sophisticated electronic warfare packages that accompany them. That assumption was the load-bearing wall of every offensive option on the table. Russia just demolished it. The S-400 system, not the downgraded export variant sold to Ankara, not the diplomatically managed partial transfer delivered to New Delhi, but the full-specification operational system, with its complete 40N6 long-range interceptor complement and its engagement capability against low-observable targets, is now deployed in Iranian hands. The airspace over Iran is no longer the same airspace it was 72 hours ago. It is now covered by the most capable ground-based air defense system ever built, operated by a military force with profound motivation to use it effectively and decades of missile warfare experience to draw upon. Against that backdrop, the destruction of Tel Aviv's port and the withdrawal of the Fifth Fleet are not simply military events. They are the first visible consequences of a strategic architecture that just snapped into place, an architecture designed not to defeat the United States in a single dramatic battle, but to make the cost of continued American military engagement in the Persian Gulf region exceed any benefit that engagement can deliver. Iran does not need to sink an American carrier. It needs only to make the environment sufficiently threatening that American force protection calculus produces the withdrawal that Iranian strategy requires. On this night, that threshold was crossed. The world that existed before these 71 hours cannot be restored. What can be understood if the analysis is honest enough and deep enough is what this new world actually is, who built it, how long they spent building it, and where it is going. That understanding is what the next 40 minutes will deliver. If this is the first time you have found this channel, subscribe immediately, because what follows is the level of analysis that the mainstream networks are structurally incapable of providing. The depth, the honesty, the willingness to follow the strategic logic wherever it leads, regardless of how uncomfortable the destination, that is what this community is built around. Hit like if this kind of coverage matters to you. Share it with everyone who deserves to understand what is actually unfolding in real time. Leave your assessment in the comments. The conversation happening in this section is genuinely one of the most informed anywhere on the platform. Now let us go into the full breakdown of the 71 hours that changed the Middle East permanently. Over the next 40 minutes, 4 questions are going to be answered with a level of operational and strategic depth that the official briefings will never voluntarily provide. First, what does the full-specification S-400 transfer actually mean for the military balance in the Persian Gulf? And why does it invalidate not just existing strike plans, but the entire conceptual framework through which Washington has approached the Iran question for a decade? Second, what does the targeting logic of the Tel Aviv port strike reveal about Iran's strategic objectives? And why is the economic dimension of that strike potentially more damaging to Israeli long-term viability than any military target could have been? Third, what drove the Fifth Fleet's withdrawal from Gulf waters at this specific moment? And what does the decision permanently alter about America's credibility as a security guarantor, not just in the Middle East, but across every alliance relationship it maintains globally? And fourth, how do Russia's S-400 transfer, Iran's port strike, and the American naval withdrawal combine into a single coherent strategic architecture? And who benefits from that architecture in the multipolar world that is now visibly taking shape? The answers are not comfortable. They are necessary. The S-400 transfer. The decision that rewrote the air war. To understand why the Russian transfer of S-400 systems to Iran constitutes a genuinely epoch-defining development, rather than simply the latest incremental upgrade in Iranian air defense capability, you need to understand what the S-400 is, what it can do that its predecessors cannot, and why every serious military planner in Washington has spent years developing contingency plans specifically around the scenario of Iranian S-400 acquisition, and why those plans are now worthless. The S-400 Triumph is not an incremental improvement over the S-300 systems that Iran has operated since 2016. It is a fundamentally different system in every dimension that matters for the air campaign planning problem. Where the S-300 PMU-2 that Russia previously supplied to Iran carries a maximum engagement range of approximately 200 kilometers against conventional targets, the S-400 equipped with 40 N-6 extended-range missiles reaches out to 400 kilometers, covering virtually the entire Persian Gulf from a single battery position in southwestern Iran. Where the S-300 struggles against low observable targets and requires significant electronic warfare support to manage modern stealth aircraft effectively. The S-400's 91 N-6E Big Bird acquisition radar operates across multiple frequency bands simultaneously, specifically designed to detect and track the radar cross-section characteristics of fifth-generation stealth platforms, including the F-22, the F-35, and the B-21. The frequency agility of the radar system makes electronic jamming significantly less effective than against single-band systems. The 40 N-6 interceptor missile, the component of the S-400 system that has most occupied American defense planners, carries a 40-kilogram blast fragmentation warhead to altitudes exceeding 30 kilometers and ranges of 400 kilometers, with an active radar seeker in the terminal phase that provides autonomous target acquisition independent of the ground-based radar. This means that even if electronic warfare assets successfully disrupt the ground radar link, the missile continues tracking its target autonomously in the terminal phase. The combination of extended range, multi-band radar, and autonomous terminal guidance creates an engagement envelope that American stealth aircraft cannot simply fly around or suppress their way through. The transfer that has just occurred was not a sudden decision made under the pressure of recent events. The groundwork was laid across years of patient Russian-Iranian strategic alignment, deepened through the Syria conflict, where IRGC and Russian forces operated in close coordination, strengthened through the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Agreement, signed in 2024, and accelerated by the shared Russian-Iranian assessment that the window for fundamentally reshaping the Persian Gulf security environment was opening in ways that would not remain open indefinitely. The Western pressure campaigns designed to prevent this transfer, sanctions threats, diplomatic demarches, private warnings through back channels, were never going to succeed because the strategic calculation driving Moscow had nothing to do with the costs Western governments threatened, and everything to do with the benefits that Russian planners had been calculating for years. Those benefits are substantial and multi-layered. First, every American military asset that must now be held back from the Persian Gulf theater to respect the S-400 engagement envelope is an asset not available for other theaters where Russian interests are directly engaged. The S-400 inches Iranian hands is simultaneously an Iranian air defense asset and a Russian strategic tool for constraining American force projection capacity globally. Second, the transfer validates Russia's position as a military technology partner of genuine consequence, a partner willing to provide capabilities that actually alter the strategic balance rather than carefully managed exports designed to improve relations without actually shifting power. Third, the demonstration that Russia can and will transfer its most capable air defense systems to aligned states in defiance of Western red lines establishes a precedent that reshapes the entire architecture of Western technology denial. regimes. The operational consequence for American and Israeli air campaign planning is immediate and severe. Every penetration route into Iranian airspace that has been developed, war-gamed, and refined over the past decade was developed against an Iranian air defense environment that did not include S-400 coverage. Those routes exploited specific gaps in Iranian radar coverage, specific limitations in the engagement geometry of S-300 batteries, specific vulnerabilities in the command and control links between different air defense elements. The S-400's 400-kilometer engagement range, combined with its multi-battery networking capability, closes every one of those gaps simultaneously. There is no approach corridor into Iranian airspace from the Persian Gulf that is not now covered by S-400 engagement geometry. Israeli F-35I aircraft, operating from bases in the Negev, would need to approach Iranian territory through an engagement envelope that begins 400 kilometers from the Iranian border well before they reach a position from which their own weapons can engage Iranian targets. The rewrite of the air campaign architecture is not merely technical, it is psychological and political. The option of military action against Iranian nuclear and military infrastructure, which has functioned for years as the ultimate backstop of American and Israeli deterrence strategy, the implied threat that gave economic and diplomatic pressure its coercive leverage, has just become dramatically more costly and operationally uncertain. When the military option becomes genuinely risky rather than reliably available, the entire architecture of coercive diplomacy that depends on its credibility collapses. Iran has just acquired, through Russian generosity, the single most valuable strategic asset available in the current environment: the ability to make its adversary's most powerful tool genuinely dangerous to use. Tel Aviv port, cutting the economic jugular. The selection of Ashdod port as the primary target for Iran's precision strike package on this night was not a decision driven by the logic of military targeting in the conventional sense. There were higher-profile military targets, available air bases, intelligence facilities, command infrastructure that would have produced more dramatic imagery and more immediately visible military effect. The choice of the port reflects a strategic sophistication that operates on a different level entirely: the level of long-term economic sustainability and the structural vulnerabilities of a small, trade-dependent economy that cannot function without reliable maritime access to global supply chains. Israel is among the most trade-dependent economies on the planet. With a population of under 10 million and a domestic market too small to sustain the full range of economic activity required by a modern high-technology society, Israel depends on imports for a substantial portion of its food, energy, raw materials, consumer goods, and critically, the military equipment and components that sustain its defense industrial base. The Ashdod port complex handles approximately 60% of that import volume. Its 5 operational berths, process container vessels, bulk carriers, fuel tankers, and military logistics ships in a continuous flow that is the economic circulatory system of the Israeli state, interrupt that flow significantly and for long enough, and the downstream effects cascade through every dimension of Israeli economic and military life. The Iranian strike package that hit Ashdod was not designed to destroy the port permanently. A permanent destruction of civilian port infrastructure would carry the political cost of a mass civilian impact that Tehran has consistently sought to avoid. It was designed to achieve something more strategically elegant: a precise, targeted degradation of operational capacity sufficient to interrupt the import flow for a period measured in months rather than days, while generating a risk environment around the port that commercial shipping operators would factor into their routing decisions independently of the physical damage. The execution reflected this logic precisely. 3 of the 5 operational berths were struck by precision ballistic missile impacts that collapsed crane infrastructure, damaged quay wall structures, and, in one case, detonated a fuel storage facility serving the terminal's operational vehicles, creating a fire that took 11 hours to extinguish and rendered the surrounding berth area inaccessible during the entire firefighting period. The rail connection linking the port to the national freight network was severed at a critical switching station, approximately 4 kilometers inland, by a cruise missile impact that was clearly aimed at extending the operational disruption beyond the port perimeter itself. The highway interchange serving the port's truck logistics flow was similarly targeted, creating a bottleneck that persisted long after the fires were controlled. But the damage to physical infrastructure, significant as it is, represents only the first-order effect of this strike. The second-order effect, the one that Iranian planners were primarily targeting, is the response of the international commercial shipping community to the demonstrated reality that Ashdod port is now within the operational engagement envelope of Iranian precision strike systems and subject to attack without warning. International shipping is operated by companies whose primary obligation is to their shareholders and their crews, not to the geopolitical interests of any particular state. When a port becomes a combat zone, not theoretically, but demonstrably, with fresh missile impacts visible in satellite imagery, the insurance market responds immediately, and the shipping companies follow. Lloyd's of London and the Joint War Committee, which set the insurance risk classifications that determine whether commercial vessels can obtain coverage for specific port calls, moved Ashdod into the highest risk category within hours of the strike confirmation. At that classification level, the additional war risk premium for a standard container vessel calling at Ashdod becomes financially prohibitive for many operators. Major shipping lines, Maersk, MSC, CMA, CGM, began issuing customer advisories within 48 hours indicating suspension of Ashdod port calls pending security reassessment. The practical effect of these commercial decisions is a shipping embargo not imposed by any government but generated organically by the risk calculus of private commercial actors responding rationally to demonstrated threat. For Israel, whose military resupply depends partially on commercial shipping channels in addition to dedicated military logistics, the combination of physical port damage and commercial shipping withdrawal creates a supply chain vulnerability that has no rapid solution. Military airlift can compensate for some high-priority cargo categories, but not for the bulk volume of fuel, food commodities, and industrial materials that move exclusively by sea. The longer the port operates at degraded capacity, and the longer commercial operators maintain their risk avoidance posture, the more the cumulative economic pressure builds quietly, without the drama of missile impacts, but with a persistence that physical reconstruction cannot address as long as the underlying threat environment persists. This is the strategic logic of striking the port rather than a military base. A military base can be repaired, restaffed, and returned to operational status within weeks. The psychological and commercial damage to a port's international shipping relationships operates on a much longer timeline and is not addressable through any amount of engineering effort. Tehran did not destroy Ashdod. It infected Ashdod with an uncertainty that will outlast the physical repairs by years. The Fifth Fleet Withdrawal. America's credibility catastrophe. The United States Naval Forces Central Command Fifth Fleet has maintained a continuous operational presence in the Persian Gulf without interruption since 1995. Through the Iraq Wars, through the Iranian nuclear confrontations of the 2000s and 2010s, through the tanker wars of 2019, through every crisis and near crisis that has periodically brought the Gulf to the edge of open conflict, the Fifth Fleet has remained. Its presence has been described as non-negotiable, permanent, and structurally integral to the regional security architecture in language so consistent and so emphatic that it became one of the fixed points around which every other actor's strategic planning was organized. Gulf states built their security architectures around it. Israel factored it into its deterrence calculations. Iran spent decades developing the military capabilities specifically designed to make it untenable. On this night, Iran's investment paid its return. The USS Bataan Amphibious Ready Group, 3 vessels carrying a Marine Expeditionary Unit and representing the Fifth Fleet's primary immediately deployable strike capability in the Upper Gulf, executed a transit through the Strait of Hormuz into the Arabian Sea. The transit was tracked in real time by commercial satellite operators whose imagery was publicly available within hours. The Fifth Fleet Public Affairs Statement describing the movement as a scheduled force rotation consistent with normal operational tempo was published simultaneously with satellite imagery showing the vessels moving at sustained, high speed through the strait, a pace inconsistent with the leisurely transits that characterize genuine routine rotations and entirely consistent with a force executing a threat-driven repositioning under time pressure. What drove the decision was the convergence of 3 simultaneous threat streams that the Bataan Group's own defensive assessment concluded could not be managed within acceptable risk parameters from its operating position in the Clearties, Upper Gulf. The first was the activation of Iranian Khalij Fars anti-ship ballistic missile batteries along the northern Gulf coastline systems, specifically designed to engage large surface targets in the confined waters of the Persian Gulf, where the limited engagement geometry and shallow water depth severely constrained the defensive maneuvering options available to surface combatants. The second was the positioning of Iranian submarine assets, Kilo-class boats, and the smaller indigenous Feta-class submarines in approach corridors that created an unacceptably complex subsurface threat picture for the group's single-embarked destroyer escort. The third, and most consequential, was the newly deployed S-400 battery, whose radar coverage extended across the entire northern Gulf, neutralizing the carrier-based aviation component that would normally provide the strike group with its primary offensive deterrent capability against shore-based threats. The combination of anti-ship ballistic missile coverage from the north, subsurface threat from multiple axes, and the elimination of effective strike aviation by the S-400 engagement envelope created a tactical environment in which the Bataan group was simultaneously incapable of conducting offensive operations and exposed to attack. Vectors that its defensive systems were not configured to defeat simultaneously. Remaining in position offered the symbolic value of continued presence while accepting genuine risk to irreplaceable assets. The decision-makers chose force protection over symbolism, a choice that was operationally rational and strategically catastrophic. The catastrophe is not the movement of 3 ships from one body of water to another. The catastrophe is what that movement communicates to every actor in the international system who has been making strategic decisions based on the assumed permanence of American naval presence in the Persian Gulf. For the Gulf Cooperation Council states Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the Fifth Fleet's presence was not merely a military asset. It was the physical embodiment of the American security guarantee that justified their entire strategic orientation toward Washington. Their decision to host American bases, to purchase American weapons systems at premium prices, to align their foreign policies with American preferences on Iran and a dozen other regional questions. All of that alignment was predicated on the belief that American military commitment to their security was unconditional and unshakable. The transit through the Strait of Hormuz has shaken it, not destroyed it. American military engagement in the region will continue in adjusted form, and Washington will make every effort to reconstruct the deterrence posture that this withdrawal has damaged. But the damage is real, and it is not fully repairable by any subsequent American action because the fundamental dynamic has been revealed. When Iranian military capability reaches a threshold sufficient to make American forward presence genuinely costly, American force protection calculus produces withdrawal. That dynamic cannot be unrevealed by returning the ships to the Gulf. Every future American forward deployment in the region will be evaluated by every local actor against the knowledge of what happened this night. The cascading effects on American alliance credibility extend far beyond the Persian Gulf. In Seoul, defense planners are modeling the implications for American extended deterrence commitments on the Korean Peninsula. In Taipei, the government is conducting a very quiet reassessment of how the Eastern Mediterranean and Persian Gulf precedents should inform its own security planning. In Warsaw and the Baltic capitals, alliance managers are asking whether the pattern of American deterrence recalibration under military pressure is a feature specific to the Middle East or a general characteristic of American alliance behavior that should inform European defense investment decisions. The answers to those questions are being shaped in real time by the satellite imagery of Fifth Fleet vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz. The axis that built this moment: Iran's self-reliance meets Russian power. The 3 developments that define this 71-hour window, S-400 transfer, port destruction, naval withdrawal, did not emerge from a vacuum. They are the visible outputs of a strategic architecture that has been under construction for years, built by actors who understood that the transformation of the Persian Gulf security environment required patience, coordination, and the willingness to absorb costs over an extended time frame before the investment produced its return. Iran's contribution to this architecture is the military capability that it built under conditions specifically designed to prevent that capability from existing. The precision strike systems that devastated Ashdod port, the Emad and Zulfiqar ballistic missiles, the Hoveza cruise missiles, are entirely domestically produced. The targeting data that enabled sub-10 meter accuracy on specific port infrastructure nodes came from Iranian intelligence collection assets, Iranian satellite imagery, and Iranian mission planning software developed without any foreign input. The operational planning that synchronized the port strike with the S-400 deployment announcement and the conditions that produced the Fifth Fleet withdrawal was conducted within Iranian military institutions by Iranian officers. The self-reliance that Western sanctions were designed to prevent has instead produced a military establishment that owes its capability to no external patron, and can therefore exercise that capability without asking anyone's permission. Russia's contribution is the S-400 and with it, something more valuable than any weapons system. The demonstration that Moscow's strategic alignment with Tehran is durable enough to survive the most intense Western pressure and deliver the most consequential possible military capability transfer at the most strategically significant possible moment. The timing of the S-400 transfer arriving in Iranian hands as the port strike was being executed and the Fifth Fleet was assessing its withdrawal decision suggests a level of strategic coordination between Moscow and Tehran that goes well beyond opportunistic alignment. These are partners who planned this convergence together, who understood the cumulative effect of simultaneous shocks, and who managed the timing of their respective contributions to maximize that cumulative effect. The IRGC soldiers who operated the precision strike systems against Ashdod did so with a quality of motivation that no amount of American financial incentive could replicate on the opposing side. They were protecting a country that has spent 50 years under siege, targeted by assassinations, sabotaged by cyber weapons, strangled by sanctions, threatened with military annihilation. The clarity of purpose that comes from defending genuine national sovereignty against sustained external assault produces a military performance that purely professional armies fighting for salaries, career advancement, and alliance obligations structurally cannot match. When a soldier understands precisely what he is fighting for, and has spent his entire adult life watching his country absorb the consequences of not fighting effectively enough, the performance that emerges from that understanding is qualitatively different from anything that can be produced by training alone. The contrast with what was observed on the opposing side is instructive. Israel's port defense systems, the combination of Iron Dome batteries, naval patrol vessels, and electronic warfare assets, tasked with protecting the Ashdod complex, performed within their design parameters against a threat environment they were not designed for. The systems were optimized for the threat as it existed when they were procured: shorter range, lower precision, lower volume. Against the precision salvo that Iran executed, the system's design parameters were insufficient. The gap between design capability and required capability is not a reflection of poor Israeli engineering. It is a reflection of an adversary that has developed faster than the defensive architecture designed to contain it. An adversary that was supposed to remain contained by economic pressure that instead provided its primary development motivation. After the tremor, the multipolar world completes its first chapter. The geopolitical architecture of the Persian Gulf region rested on three pillars that the events of these 71 hours have systematically compromised. The first pillar was American air dominance, the assumption that no regional actor could deny American aircraft access to any airspace in the theater. The S-400 transfer has compromised this pillar by creating an Iranian air defense envelope that makes American air operations over and around Iran genuinely costly for the first time. The second pillar was Israeli economic invulnerability, the assumption that Israel's trade-dependent economy was protected from disruption by the combination of American military backing and superior Israeli military capability. The Ashdod port strike has compromised this pillar by demonstrating that Iranian precision strike systems can reach and degrade Israel's economic infrastructure, regardless of the defensive systems protecting it. The third pillar was American naval primacy in the Gulf, the assumption that Fifth Fleet presence was permanent and unchallengeable. The withdrawal has compromised this pillar by demonstrating that Iranian military capability can produce American naval repositioning without a single American vessel being struck. Three pillars compromised simultaneously in 71 hours. The architecture they supported cannot stand on compromised foundations. In Moscow, senior officials are conducting themselves with the practiced restraint of players who have just watched a long-term investment produce exactly the return that was projected. Russia did not fire a single weapon on this night. It did not need to. The S-400 transfer, executed at the moment of maximum strategic effect, produced consequences for American military posture and alliance credibility that years of Russian diplomatic and military effort in other theaters had not achieved. The asymmetric return on investment of providing Iran with a single air defense system is staggering. The neutralization of American air campaign options against Iran, the demonstration of Russian willingness to cross Western red lines without penalty, and the acceleration of Gulf state strategic recalibration away from exclusive American dependency, all purchased at the cost of transferring hardware that Russia produces in quantity and can replace. In Beijing, the assessment is similarly positive, but operates on a longer strategic horizon. China's interest in the Persian Gulf is primarily economic. The uninterrupted flow of energy from the Gulf to Chinese industry is a strategic priority of the first order. A Gulf security environment in which American military primacy is more contested and in which regional states are recalibrating toward a more diversified security architecture creates space for Chinese economic and diplomatic engagement that the previous American-dominated environment foreclosed. The Belt and Road infrastructure investments that China has made across the region, port facilities, rail connections, industrial zones are better protected in a multipolar Gulf than in a unipolar one. Because in a multipolar environment, their protection depends on Chinese economic relationships rather than on American military goodwill. For the Gulf states watching these developments, the strategic recalibration already underway is accelerating. Saudi Arabia's decision to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the UAE's careful cultivation of relationships with both Washington and Beijing, Qatar's diplomatic flexibility, these are not random or isolated decisions. They are the outputs of strategic assessments that concluded, years before this night, that the American security guarantee was not unconditional, and that prudent states should hedge accordingly. The events of these 71 hours validate those assessments in the most emphatic possible way, and will accelerate the hedging behavior that has already begun. The energy market consequences of the Fifth Fleet withdrawal will compound over time in ways that the immediate price movements do not fully capture. The insurance and shipping risk premiums that apply to Gulf transit were already elevated before this night. With the Fifth Fleet repositioned away from the Upper Gulf and Iranian military capability having demonstrated its reach against Israeli port infrastructure, the commercial risk environment for energy shipping through the region has worsened materially. The Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of global oil trade transits daily, is now overlooked by S-400 radar coverage. The ships that transit it do so in an environment where the most capable ground-based air defense system ever built is operated by the regional power, with the greatest motivation to use it as a strategic tool. The emerging multipolar order that these events are accelerating is not the comfortable, rules-based multipolarity that liberal international relations theorists have described as the desirable alternative to American unilateralism. It is a messier, more dangerous, more contested multipolarity, in which multiple centers of military and economic power pursue incompatible interests in overlapping geographic spaces, without the stabilizing framework that American primacy for all its flaws and abuses provided. The transition from the old order to the new one is the most dangerous period in any systemic shift, because old deterrence relationships have broken down and new ones have not yet been established. The risk of miscalculation is highest precisely when the rules are least clear. What Iran, Russia, and their aligned partners have achieved in these 71 hours is not the completion of a new order. It is the demolition of the old one, the clearing of the ground on which whatever comes next will be built. The S-400 batteries now operational in Iran will not be returned. The commercial shipping relationships damaged by the Ashdod strike will not be fully restored to their pre-strike configuration as long as the threat environment persists. The credibility damage sustained by American alliance commitments through the Fifth Fleet withdrawal will not be repaired by any subsequent deployment, because the dynamic it revealed, that American force protection calculus can produce withdrawal under sufficient Iranian military pressure, is now a known quantity that every regional actor will factor into its planning. Permanently. The world that existed before these 71 hours was already changing. The world after them is changing faster, in a direction that the architects of the old order did not choose and cannot reverse. 3 developments. 71 hours. The permanent alteration of a regional security architecture that took 30 years to build. The S-400 inches Iranian hands is not just a weapons transfer. It is Moscow's declaration that the era of Western veto power over Russian strategic decisions about which partners receive which capabilities has ended. The destruction of Tel Aviv's port is not just a military strike. It is Tehran's demonstration that Israeli economic vulnerability extends to infrastructure that was supposed to be protected by the most expensive defensive architecture in the Middle East. And the Fifth Fleet's passage through the Strait of Hormuz is not just a naval repositioning. It is the visible, satellite-documented, historically recorded moment when the assumption of permanent American military primacy in the Persian Gulf encountered its operational limit and blinked. What these 3 events tell us, read together, is that a strategy has matured. A strategy built on patience, self-reliance, strategic partnership, and the willingness to absorb decades of external pressure while quietly building the capability required to change the terms of the confrontation. Iran did not defeat the United States in a battle. It outlasted the conditions under which American military primacy was sustainable, and it did so by building under sanctions, under sabotage, under the threat of annihilation, a military and strategic capability that the pressure designed to prevent it instead made inevitable. The question that now confronts every government in the world is not whether this has happened. The satellite imagery is public, the damage assessments are being published, the fleet's position is tracked in real time. The question is what it means for the decisions that must be made in the weeks and months ahead. Will Washington find a path toward genuine diplomatic engagement with an Iran that has now demonstrated it cannot be coerced into strategic surrender? Will Tel Aviv's leadership acknowledge that a security model dependent on borrowed power and unconditional external support has reached the end of its operational viability? Will the Gulf states complete the strategic diversification that prudence has long demanded and that these events have now made urgent? These are the questions that will define the next chapter. And the answers, whenever they come, from whoever provides them, will be shaped by what happened in these 71 hours, in the fires over Tel Aviv's port, in the radar returns of S-400 systems painting Iranian airspace, and in the wake of Fifth Fleet vessels transiting southward through the Strait of Hormuz in the hours before dawn. Tell us in the comments, does this convergence of events represent the decisive turning point in Middle Eastern history? Or is American power capable of reconstituting itself on new terms that can restore the deterrence architecture that these 71 hours have damaged? Your analysis matters. Share this video with everyone who needs to understand what is actually happening behind the headlines. Hit like if this delivered the depth you came for. Subscribe for continuous coverage as this crisis develops. The next analysis is already being prepared, and the next chapter of this story is already being written in capitals that have not yet finished absorbing what these 71 hours mean. We will see you there.